Well, where are we? We have so much ground to cover. I did not finish discussing Chuck Taylor, and I think that's because there's some crucial parts of his account that I don't fully understand, and I can't make sense out of them. He makes what he thinks is a crucial distinction between intersubjective meanings and common meanings, and the idea that he has is that there are certain common meanings like freedom and democracy, and then within those there are certain common practices like the practice of negotiation, negotiating labor management disputes. Well, fair enough. I would put that as in terms of particular and general. That is, there are for certain general background institutional structures, and then there are specific applications of those. But he then says something very peculiar, namely that the intersubjective meanings are out there in the world. They're not in individual heads or individual minds, and I can't make sense of that. It seems to me the practice of negotiation has to be construed as something that is done by individuals acting through collective intentionality. And I can't make any sense out of there being intersubjectivity which isn't collective intentionality. And I think this may be due to the fact that people have a notion of intersubjectivity which is somehow or other it's not in individuals' heads, and it's not supposed to be mysterious either. It's not supposed to be like a Hegelian world spirit, but as I said, I can't make sense of it. For me, I can make sense of intersubjectivity if it's a matter of collective intentionality, but for reasons that I've stated in some detail, all collective intentionality has to be in individual heads. Okay, so I'm not going to say much more about Chuck Taylor, but maybe I'll read it over the weekend and see if I can come up with something more interesting to say about it. Well, we have been talking about forms of explanation in the social sciences, and I've been insisting that social explanations must appeal to intentional causation. Sometimes they can appeal to collective intentional causation, as if somebody says, for example, well, the results of Tuesday's elections reveal the fact that there's general dissatisfaction on the part of the voters throughout most of the country with what's going on in Washington. Specifically, there's dissatisfaction with the Democratic government of a Democratic control of both the legislative and the executive. Now, that's collective intentionality. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's the form of explanation, and it seems to me that's perfectly legitimate. Now, there are forms of explanation that don't appear to cite collective intentionality or even individual intentionality, but I think they do, in fact. What they do, if you say the rational entrepreneur sells where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, what you are describing is a systematic fallout of a rational, self-interested or maximizing behavior. So if the entrepreneur is trying to make the most amount of money, which that's intentional causation, then this will have a consequence. And the consequence is that if he has, in a situation of perfect information, he will sell where his marginal cost equals his marginal revenue, because he can't make any more money by increasing his sales, by increasing his output, and any decrease will decrease the amount of money that he makes. So that apparently doesn't use intentional causation, but it does in fact. And if you look at the examples that Becker gives us as what he thinks of established laws of economics, that if you increase the supply of a product, you will decrease its price. Those are similarly applications of intentionality. The idea is that if there are more goods of a certain type available on the market, then in order to appeal to the consumers to buy those goods, the price will have to come down to sell that many goods on the market. But that's, again, a case of appealing to intentionality. Intentional causation functions throughout, even in cases where it's not obvious on the surface that it does function. Now that, I want to repeat a criticism I made of functionalist explanations, where the functionalist says, well, the manifest function doesn't explain why the institution survives, because the institution doesn't succeed in performing that function. It's the latent function that explains its survival. So in primitive cultures, the rain dance survives not because it produces more rain, it doesn't, but because it leads to social cohesion. You have a more socially cohesive group if everybody gets around and does the rain dance. But I think if you're really going to take that seriously as an explanation, analogous to Darwinian explanations, then you have to say, what is the mechanism by which social cohesion, increased social cohesion, improves the survival probabilities of the rain dance? And I don't see any answer to that question given in the functionalist analysis. In other words, in the case of the Darwinian model of explanation, survival was no longer a goal of the plant in turning its leaves toward the sun, but rather survival is something that happens because plants that turn their leaves toward the sun have a greater chance of surviving than plants that don't. But, and this is the crucial point, in order for that explanation to work, there has to be a purely mechanical explanation of how the plant turns its leaves toward the sun in such a way as to increase its probability of survival, and that is given by specifying the growth hormone, auxin, that actually produces variable behavior of the plant's leaves and thus produces the increased survival probabilities of the plant. What's the analog? What's the analogous mechanism for auxin in the case of the survival of the rain dance? I don't see it. To take it closer to home, suppose it were shown, suppose somebody did a study and showed that in fact prayer was not efficacious. They get half of the population to pray for one result and the other half of the population to pray for the other result, and it turns out that prayer has no effect on the outcome. And you do this, imagine that this is funded by the National Science Foundation. It never would be, but imagine that it is, and that they do a systematic study over a period of many years and showing that prayer does not increase the probability of the outcome of the thing prayed for. Would people stop praying? I don't think so. Not for a moment. And the reason is not because, well, prayer increases social cohesion, but because people, as a part of their individual intentionality, think maybe God will listen to me. It's true that they did these damn tests with the National Science Foundation, but who cares about them? I am attempting to communicate with God. I was interviewed on TV once by a guy named Moyers, and I expressed more or less heretical views. And he said, but don't you pray? And what I tried to say was, look, everybody prays. The mistake is to think that anybody's listening to the prayer. Of course, you should pray, but don't suppose anybody's listening. That's the error. But it isn't because people want to increase social cohesion that they pray. It's because they want to communicate with God. I mean, I never met anybody who said, well, the explanation of my prayer is it does increase social cohesion, even though it does not increase the probability that the prayed outcome will ensue. The National Science Foundation and the NIH, incidentally, are very peculiar institutions. I was once asked to appraise a proposal for funding from the National Science Foundation, and it was about artificial intelligence. And I wrote as my appraisal, look, the project is certain to fail, but you should fund it anyhow, because philosophy and science advance by discovering blind alleys, and this guy really does have a blind alley. And besides, it's not an awful lot of money. It's not a hell of a lot of money. Well, apparently the NSF had never received such a letter. And I got a personal letter of thanking me from the head of the National Science Foundation for what a wonderfully honest and refreshing recommendation that I had written. Apparently they never got a recommendation like that. That's the good news. The bad news is they gave the guy the money, and he somehow found out that I had written this. I had written a letter on his behalf. So for years, he wanted me to write letters of recommendation for him. I didn't have the heart to tell him the letter that I wrote. But in any case, your letters have sometimes an unpredictable effect. Okay, anyway, Now, the general lesson that I want to draw about explanation of the social sciences is always look at it from the first person point of view. How does it seem to the agent? What does the agent think that he or she is doing? And people don't pray or perform the rain dance because they want to increase social cohesion. They do it because they want to affect the outcome. That's the aim of the entire enterprise. Now, in the cases where it looks like you've got some law, you see, Becker gives us a couple of laws that he thinks are completely general, and he treats them as if they were like laws of physics. The law that says that an increase in supply will produce a decrease in price, and I'm suggesting, no, that's just a summary of intentional causation. Now, a good illustration of that are apparent exceptions to that law, and I'll give you an example. As it happens, I own a ski condominium in a famous ski resort not all that far from here up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's a nice place to have because you can walk to the lift. It's very, very near the ski lift. Now, the entrepreneurs, the speculators, build a huge complex of condominiums right next to the lift where you literally you could walk to the lift in your bedroom slippers. I mean, it's just right across the street, much closer than my place. Now, on standard economic theory, this huge supply of condominiums, that the plural is probably condominia, I don't know, but anyway, condominiums, would presumably reduce the value of my condominium. Not at all. It's shot up. It nearly doubled. Now, why did the value of my place double? Well, basically, I mean, it's a variation of Say's law that supply creates its demand. These new condos there was an enormous amount of publicity, and they gave all these open houses where they gave you free booze, and they took you through these dreadful places. The architecture was hideous. I told the person taking us through that it reminded me of the Radisson Inn in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I mean, it did. It's a lot like if you've ever stayed in the Radisson. It's that same kind of utterly blank architecture. It's nothing. And I said, do you really think this will appear in Architectural Digest? Will architecture students be forced to come and study this as a great artistic achievement? They looked at me as if I didn't know what I was talking about. They're just trying to sell condos. But the upshot of it was that these absurdly overpriced condos, they were ridiculously priced. I mean, nearly $1 million for the most boring hunk of junk you ever saw in your life. What they did was double the price of my place, because somebody looks at this and they figure down the road there's a smaller condo unit within a 3 minutes walk of here, where it's going for a square foot about half of what it's going for here. So this is a case where we didn't refute the law that an increase in supply will lower the price. No, we just showed that the law was an application of certain principles of intentionality, certain constitutive principles of intentionality, and consequently, when the conditions varied, those same principles would give the opposite result. In other words, the laws of economics that Becker cites are not like the laws of physics. You don't derive them from basic physical laws in a way that you can derive centrifugal force from Newton's first law of motion. A statement of the law of motion will entail a centrifugal force. Don't ask me to do the derivation, but it can be done. But what we're talking about is intentional causation and how it functions. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the mistake is to think that somehow or other we're doing a natural science. We're not. It's all functions against a background, against a certain set of assumptions about which things are for sale and what constitutes buying and selling. And then I made specific criticisms of Becker's analysis last time. And today, all of that's by way of introduction. I now want to go on to some other subjects, but first let's take questions about any of that. I saw your hand up. Yeah.
You said it was a variation of some other law?
Say's law. Before the Great Depression, people reasoned that depressions were impossible because supply creates its own demand. and this is, I don't ask me who Say was or where he got this law, but in this textbook this was always referred to as Say's law. I doubt if anybody refers to it anymore because it's been so discredited. But there was, until the Great Depression, it was quite common to say depressions, colossal depressions can't happen because an increase in supply will create its own demand. Say's law, and Say was cited as the authority. So go Google Say's and report back. Okay. Any other deep philosophical questions? Yes. Between what and what? Yeah. Well, physicalism is the idea that everything is physical, and that is to say, on the standard interpretation, there are no irreducibly mental phenomena. And a standard understanding of physicalism is to say that any mental phenomena can be reduced to physical phenomena, and it seems natural to suppose, therefore, that that explanations of human behavior will be reducible to physics. Now, what was the other one? Yeah, well, reductionism is in general the idea that some phenomenon can be reduced to something else, and reductionism is a very peculiar form of the identity relation because it is the nothing but relation. So A equals B says A is identical with B, but A is reducible to B, says A is nothing but B, suggesting that A has been masquerading as something more. And in the standard account, I'm sure you're familiar with them, the mental life is nothing but brain processes, for example. Now, I have argued, I'm not entirely convinced the profession, that in fact you can have your materialism and your dualism at the same time, that once you recognize that consciousness and intentionality are irreducible to neurobiological processes, that is to say, they are ontologically irreducible because they have this first-person ontology. You don't have to deny that they are causally reducible. So I make two different kinds of reduction. My mental states are causally reducible to brain processes. All of the causal powers of my present thirst, with its dramatic ability to make me ingest H2O, even under the most inappropriate of circumstances, all of that is causally reducible to, well, I won't tell you the whole damn story. For one thing, it keeps changing. But in any case, it's a bunch of neurobiological processes in the brain that cause thirst. So it's causally reducible, but it's not ontologically reducible because, of course, there's a certain feeling of thirst, and you can't describe that feeling just by describing variable rates of neuron firings in the hypothalamus, which is where presumably it's going on. Okay, other questions? All right, let's go ahead. Now, oh yeah, I'm sorry, here are the deep questions over here, yeah.
Well, so we were talking about Fodor today.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is also something like, what is the real difference between a token physicalist account like Fodor or Davidson and you? Yeah,
well, I'm not sure how to characterize that, but the way that I read those guys is this. On Davidson's account, it's hard to see how the mental states are other than epiphenomenal, because he says beliefs and desires cause actions. For every action, for every causal relation, there must be a causal law, but the causal laws are stated entirely in physicalist terms. The causal laws are stated entirely physically. Now add one sentence to that, and you get epiphenomenalism. The sentence you have to add to that is, what causal laws do is state aspects under which events function causally. So on Davidson's own account, there will be descriptions of the event which do not instantiate the law, but then they're irrelevant to its causal powers. To take an example I keep using, I say the thing that Sally did caused the phenomenon that John saw. Now the causal law won't mention John and Sally. If the thing that Sally did was put the pot of water on the stove, and the thing that John saw was the pot of water boiling, then it's true. The thing that Sally did caused the thing that John saw. But the causal law won't say anything about John and Sally. It will talk about the kinetic energy of water molecules in the Earth's atmosphere, and boiling occurs when the mean kinetic energy of the interior the pressure. Well, I'm not going to go through the whole damn thing. You can go look it up. But it's the law about boiling water in the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, now that's a case where you had a causal statement. There is a causal law, but the terms in which the causal law is stated are not the same as which the singular causal statement was stated. But, and this is where I'm adding something to Davidson, the terms in which the causal law is stated cite causally relevant aspects. It's because of the increase in the kinetic energy inside the system of water molecules that that damn thing boils. All right, and that's generally the case with causation. You want to know not just what event caused what event, but what features of the event made it causally effective. And that's what is left out of Davidson's account, because a natural conclusion, if the causal law states causally relevant features, or what I call causal aspects, then his conclusion forces us to epiphenomenalism. And I want to say it's not epiphenomenal. If you get a result that says my intention and action, the actual mental features of my intention and action had nothing to do with my arm going up when I decide to raise my arm and then raise it, if you say that, you know you made a mistake, because this is a case where the intentional content of my intention and action caused my arm to go up. So epiphenomenalism can't be right. It's not a serious hypothesis. A recent defender of epiphenomenalism is Dave Chalmers, who's lecturing at 4 o'clock today. If anybody, he won't be talking, he's going to talk about Quine on the analytic-synthetic distinction. But in any case, you want to know about me and Dave, I wrote a review which was published in the New York Review and was then reprinted in a collection called The Mystery of Consciousness. And he then wrote a reply to my review, and I wrote a reply to his reply. Okay, so you can you read all that if you're interested in reading it. You can buy it in any bookstore. It's called The Mystery of Consciousness, or you can get it online. Okay, so my objection to Davidson is that his account results in epiphenomenalism, and we know that epiphenomenalism is mistaken. Epiphenomenalism is a stunning thesis for anybody to maintain. On the epiphenomenalist account, no human being in the history of the world ever ate because they were hungry, or drank because they were thirsty, or tried to go to sleep because they were sleepy, because all of those cite mental states functioning causally, and mental states can't function causally. Okay, so I don't, it's hard to take epiphenomenalism seriously. I mean, I'm prepared to argue it in more detail, but on my account, the mental states function causally. Of course, they can only do that because they're grounded in the plumbing. They're grounded in the brain. But that's true of all causes. You know, the explosion in the cylinder only causes the piston to move because it's grounded in the release of energy by the oxidization of hydrocarbon molecules. Okay, say some more. Yeah.
So here's a quick sentence from Fodor, for
Yeah.
example. And my question is, I lose my grip on what your beef is when they say things like that the point is to explicate the point of giving an account of the special sciences, physical terms, is to explicate the physical mechanisms whereby events conform to the laws of the special sciences.
Yeah.
They're doing the same thing.
No, they're not.
They want to give, insofar as they want to ground the macro in the micro.
Yeah.
And then when you resist that, tell us why you're not a property realist.
Okay, all right. Well, that's fortunately we got all day today for all this. Okay, here's Fodor's story. You have multiple realizability on both the A and B part, and you have A causes B. This is your higher level law. And then you have X1, X2, X3, X4, and X5, and so on. Now, why is it that you apparently get exceptions? Here's Fodor says it's because of multiple realizability that of the A term and the B term that the laws don't give you a perfect match. So X6, X7, X8, you may get a law that goes straight from x1 to x2 to x7 and x3 to x8, but maybe x5 just goes out in left field. I'm just copying his diagram. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't go through the diagram with his own example, and I can tell you why he doesn't, because it doesn't work. Here is the example. Gresham's law says that bad money drives out good money. And that's his example. Introduction of bad money. Okay. Bad money. And over here it's drives out good money. All right? Now how is it supposed to work? Down here are coins made of silver or copper, and then all the other possibilities. You can have checks or credit cards or all sorts of stuff. But let's just take silver and copper to make it simple. What are the physical properties of silver and copper that make the introduction of copper quarters, copper and zinc? The dreadful things you have in your pocket are an amalgam, I guess, of copper and zinc. What are the physical properties of copper and zinc that result in all of these things being hoarded? They go out there and get hoarded or whatever. Oh no, maybe they're supposed to be over here. I'm not actually sure how it's supposed to be. Over here on the right-hand side are people putting silver coins in their dresser drawers. Okay, and what are the properties of silver that are supposed to produce that result, the hoarding? Now here is the problem. You can make this work for things like the laws of erosion in geology, because erosion will work differently for different kinds of soil. If you have sand, if you have a clay soil, a fast-moving river will erode the outside corner of a bank more than the inside corner. It'll draw sediment, and then you get these big half-moon lakes. That's a good example of this, where the law works differently for different kinds of material. But the problem in the case of Fodor's actual example, money, is what binds the stuff together as money is not its physical properties or even a disjunction of its physical properties. It's the attitudes that people take. And what makes all of this money is attitudes. It's the intentionality. And the intentionality toward silver is different from the intentionality toward zinc and copper. That is the crucial distinction. So the failure of Fodor is that he thinks it's just a disjunction of laws at the physical level. It's not. He leaves out the fact that the binding principle that makes all of this one of introducing money and all of this over here case of saving and spending money is not a physical phenomenon in his sense. It's an intentional phenomenon. It has to do with the attitudes that people take toward gold, silver, paper, etc. Yes?
He agrees with that, though. So,
no, he agreed with it when one of my students who was at MIT told him about that.
Well, I mean, in this article, right, what he's saying, what makes the P level a unified disjunct is precisely just that it's a translation of the special science into the physical mechanisms it happens to have.
Okay,
and
yeah.
you don't thereby get a law at the bottom level.
What do you get?
You get something that is not law. You get something anomalous at the P level.
Yeah, but what he says is that the reason you get the anomaly is because you don't get a perfect match between this disjunct and this disjunct. You get exceptions. You get things over here that will go out in left field. I want to say that's irrelevant. What matters is the intentionality at each level, not the variable realization. To put the distinction in one sentence, Fodor thinks multiple realizability of the higher level phenomena and the lower level will have the consequence that there are cases at the lower level that don't where the left-hand side doesn't match the right-hand side, where the left-hand side goes out to left field. I am saying multiple realizability has nothing to do with it. Or rather, it only has to do with it because the multiple realizability is ground together as a phenomenon of money by a set of intentional attitudes. And he has no ground for that. Now, he might say, oh, well, but then you have to do this level at the brain. What would that look like?
He's happy to have there not be a law at the P level. I mean, what unifies the disjunct is precisely only the fact natural kinds aren't going to have bridge laws down to natural kinds at the physical level when you get this kind of mismatch. And
No.
so he's perfectly
Yeah, but
happy to say it and really just give an account of what the physical mechanism of money happens to be without tying it to a law at the bottom level. He doesn't need for the top and the bottom to stand or fall together.
yeah, but there isn't any physical mechanism. That's my point. See, here's his picture. The picture is because of the variable realizability of the top level, this is money up here, and this is silver, copper, paper, credit cards down here, and this is different physical consequences of silver, copper, paper, credit cards. I want to say the physical consequences don't matter. What matters is the attitudes that people have. And he doesn't say that. His picture, and it's not surprising, he doesn't go through with it how it's supposed to work for Gresham's law, because it couldn't. You couldn't make it work for Gresham's law. You can make it work for geology, where the multiple realizability does have different consequences. And indeed, we know if you make your stream out of concrete, the side of the stream, the corner doesn't wear away the way the bank of a stream on a normal field wears away, because the concrete is precisely designed so that this principle of the curvature of the floodplain won't operate. But what he leaves out is the fact that in the case of the social sciences, what binds the multiple realizability together is not a disjunction of physical properties. It's a set of attitudes. And this is why you get an openness here. So the people in Sparta can regard huge, heavy iron bars as money. Remember, I told you at one point the Spartans had these huge iron bars as money because they didn't want anybody taking money out of town. And nowadays, most of your money has no physical realization at all. There is no physical object, which is your money. There's rather a record in the bank. There's a magnetic trace on a computer disk that says, well, you don't have much money left, I'm supposing, by now, but it gives you some money that you have left in the bank, and that's all there is to the money. There's no physical realization at all. So Fodor's account doesn't work for his own example. His example is Gresham's law. He doesn't show how it's supposed to work, and I don't think he could. Now you might say, well, why doesn't it work at the neurobiological level? And in a way, I want to say precisely for the kind of reason he tells us. The fact that money can take almost any physical form means that there's no common stimulus pattern on my brain labeled money. There are all kinds of things, seeing silver and lusting after gold, or just seeing $1,000 bills and salivating over the $1,000 bills. All of these will produce different stimulus patterns on my retina with different physical consequences in the brain. Okay, but anyway, I mean, I'm willing to give you the last word.
Well, he embraces that. I feel like the thing you're holding against him is the thing that he embraces. He's not trying to give you a physical law from this set to that set.
Yeah.
I feel like what he's trying to do is just give an account of how, as you say, all of our intentionality and
okay, but if
everything bottoms out in the physical. But
then what's the point of the diagram?
Just to show how, in fact, everything in the special sciences is physical.
But that doesn't work for economics, his example, because it doesn't show how money is physical to show that all kinds of different things can be money. And indeed, most of your money isn't physical. There is no physical realization. There's only a representation.
Well, that's okay, but I mean, you're going to agree that the representing item is itself physical.
Yeah, but now watch this carefully, you see. The representing item isn't money. We have now reached the point where you can have money with no physical object, which is your money, but just a record of how much money you have. And when you spend that money with a debit card, with checks you get something that's like money, but with a debit card, all you get is a change in the representation. In the case of money, the representation is enough. I want to say this is a very misleading diagram. Oh no, it's not just misleading. For money, it's false. Because the laws of money have nothing to do with the different physical realizations. They have to do with desires. They have to do with the intentionality. And he doesn't, this is incapable of describing that phenomenon. So the fact that there are exceptions is not because the laws correlating silver here and silver here allow for exceptions. That's not it at all. It's because the fact that it's silver is is not what's important. What's important about money is the attitudes that people take. Okay, other questions? Any other questions? Because this is important, and I hope. Shouldn't we give out more questions for the next paper? When are we going to do that? All right. Well, we'll get you some more questions so you can be working on your next topic, and this might be a good question. Is discuss Fodor's analysis. Okay, I now want to talk about power and political power. You see, we've reached the point in the course where I've given you a theory of social ontology, and now I want to apply it. I want to apply it to a whole lot of other issues. And one of the fun things I want to apply it to, which I won't work on it today, but I want you to start thinking about, is why did socialism fail? Now, I'm not going to talk about that today, but I want you to start thinking about the question. Now, your generation did not attribute the magical properties to socialism that my generation did. And in some places in the world, people still hold socialism as an ideal. And I want you to reflect on why did it fail? Because if you write on the blackboard the properties of a socialist society, and on the left-hand side, and the properties of a capitalist economy on the right-hand side, the socialist system looks vastly better. So the question is, why was it a spectacular failure everywhere? Indeed, even in those countries where they still keep parties called socialist parties, they've given up on it. The wonderful thing is the British Labour Party, with the British Socialist Party, which essentially has an economic policy indistinguishable from Margaret Thatcher. They've given up entirely on the great debates. Now, none of you lived through these debates, but there was a great debate about Clause 4 of the Labour Party platform, which said we must attain the commanding heights of the economy. The means of production must be publicly owned. So that was item number one, public ownership of the means of production. Now, it's true, in most socialist societies, you were still going to be allowed to own your shirt, but the means of production were going to be publicly owned. And in some countries, you weren't even going to be allowed to own your house. You would rent. You would have to rent from the public authorities. There would be public ownership of all of the means of production. Secondly, there were to be no vast differences in wealth. You might pay a guy a little more if he actually produced more. The Stakhanovite ought to get paid more, but the basic principle was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And if you weren't able to make the kind of contribution that the guy on the the next lathe, well, that's no reason why he should be paid more than you, because we will pay you not according to your contribution, but according to your need. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, the list I'm giving you comes from G.D.H. Cole, who was the leading Marxist theoretician in Britain for a very long time. And indeed, he wrote a large number of books, two of which are one is entitled The Meaning of Marxism, and the next one was entitled What Marx Really Meant. Now, I like that in a way better than me, because I had to think of titles that, though the subject matter was quite similar, I had a completely different syntax, but Cole didn't bother to go through that struggle. Okay, so there'd be no vast differences in wealth, and there would be, this is more specific to England, no vast class differences. Everybody ought to be able to meet everybody else on a basis of social equality. Now, America kind of has that without trying very hard. It's true you don't get complete equality, but you get a kind of equality that's inconceivable in the England of my childhood. To this day, when people come from Oxford to stay in my house, they're amazed at how I speak to my gardener. I speak to him as I would speak to an equal. And no English property owner ever speaks to his gardener as if he were speaking to an equal. Now, it's true, this is a British gardener, which means he's a former PhD student in Berkeley, and I don't know if it's like this over the rest of the country, but and he's from Senegal, and he speaks excellent French, though we do tend to speak in English. But in any case, America never had the kind of class differences that we had in England. In England, I could talk to somebody for 30 seconds and tell you immediately what his class background was because of his clothing, the accent that he spoke. There were so many indices, status indicators of class differences. And Cole was arguing that in a socialist society there would be no vast class differences. And then the final proposition on the definition of socialism was everybody contributes. You don't have a vast, rich leisure class where nobody ever does any work. And there's a peculiar form of irrationality, if you like it, about the American economy, and that is in America, when people get rich, what they want more than anything is to get richer. You see, if you are as rich as some of the people who make billions and billions, you might think, well, okay, I don't have to waste my time designing yet another computer or trying to get a bigger share of the market. I might go and enjoy all these billions. Not for a moment. American billionaires want nothing more than to be multi-billionaires. Now, we benefit from that because what happens in England, again, I'm not sure this is true, but it was when I lived there, is that as soon as somebody got rich, they became country squires. They quit whatever they were doing and went off and bought a country estate and took up fox hunting and riding to the hounds and all that type of stuff. So, for example, there was a guy in Oxford who had a professorship. He was a moderately distinguished philosopher. He inherited some money. He instantly stopped teaching philosophy and became a country squire. People in the city, if they actually succeeded in the stock market, they made a couple of £1 million immediately. They bought a house in Sussex or wherever and only came up to town to go to parties. But basically they adopted the life of the country gentleman. And indeed, there is in America no career of the gentleman. There's no career of the country gentleman. Even people who have totally unproductive lives have to pretend they're doing something. So the super rich people I know, if you ask them what they're doing, they will always cite some gainful employment that they're engaged in. So it is an oddity of the, or maybe it's an oddity of England, but it was an oddity of the United States that after anybody has reached the optimum curve of disposable wealth, what they want is to get more money. They want, having made billions, they want yet more billions. Why? I'm not sure, but that seems to be, there is a numerical calculus of success, and there's, so to speak, no upper limit on how much you can succeed. In any case, these were the ideals, and Cole, to his credit, though he was the leading theorist of the time, used to have a bunch of us around on Wednesday night, Oxford undergraduates who would learn the ideals of socialism. I was always a bit cynical about this, but I have to tell you, the general atmosphere was that of a religious gathering. So nobody ever asked, what's the best system of education? They asked, what is a socialist system of education? And that was the key. The key question is, what would a socialist educational system look like? And I pointed out, this again was many years ago, nobody ever seemed to think that in a socialist system, boys and girls ought to go to the same school. That was regarded as too revolutionary for this particular group. But that was the attitude. It was like, what is a truly Christian education? I'm sure there are people who have this discussion now. In those days, the discussion was, what was a socialist education? Okay, now I'm not going to answer these questions today. Here's the question. As far as I can tell, socialism failed everywhere. The places where it is still the official ideology, I have to say, are not spectacularly successful. North Korea is the most stunning example of a continuing socialist government, and Cuba is another one. Cuba and North Korea are surviving cases of socialism, and they are not widely imitated throughout the world, though I think Cuba still exerts some a kind of an ideal in countries like Venezuela. But I don't know anywhere where North Korea is admired. But in general, in other countries, the socialist ideal is no longer maintained, even at a time when capitalism is in a terrible strait, even at a time when capitalism is in fairly desperate shape. Okay, now I'm not going to answer these questions today, but I want you to be thinking about them. The question I'm going to answer today is, what is political power? We're going to talk about power today, but I saw a couple of hands up, and I have to take them. Yes.
Socialism has probably acquired extended meaning. Like the French consider themselves socialists, and Finland does.
Yeah, this is why I put this on the blackboard.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's an extended meaning because it's socialism because they want a government program.
Yeah. Oh, no, but by socialism, I don't mean the Republican Party description of Berkeley, where they think, my God, we're worse than socialism. But I thought, let's get an agreed definition, and I thought I would take the theorist of Marxism that I'm most familiar with, G.D.H. Cole, no longer famous, but he was very famous in his lifetime as the leading British theoretician of socialism, and this was his definition. Public ownership of the means of production, no huge differences between the rich and the poor. You know, there might be some people driving fancy cars and other people driving cheap cars, but you wouldn't have these vast differences. There would be no class differences, and Americans don't know what a class difference is, so we don't have to worry about that. What we had in place of class differences were racial differences. So we had racial and ethnic distinctions that function somewhat like a class distinction. And then the idea was everybody has to contribute. You don't have a parasitic leisure class. You don't have social parasites, or at least not very many. Yes?
So in the examples of socialism that we have, every single time they attempt public ownership at means of production, translated into the government ownership at
Yeah.
means of production, and then you have totalitarianism instead of socialism. So if we examine how the totalitarian regimes failed
Yeah.
or are doomed to fail, like North
Yeah.
Korea, then I don't know how we can use
This definition.
this definition to
Okay, but that's going to be one of the topics we need to discuss. What do they mean? What does it mean to say there will be public ownership? It looks like it can only mean government ownership, right? What else is it supposed to mean? And the idea was, yeah, but there'll be different kinds of government ownership. The National Coal Board will not be a crude, just a government department. It'll be more like, well, Oxford University. It will be, in general, under the control of the government, but it won't be just another element of the bureaucracy. But now we're talking about how these are supposed to be applied in practice. Okay, I want to talk about power. Now, we're going to talk first about power and then about political power. But as I said, I'm going to come back to this, and I want you to be thinking about it, because it is an amazing fact that socialism no longer inspires the young. It doesn't inspire people, even in, well, I might almost say, especially in Western Europe. Occasionally, you get little knots of Marxism left around, but socialism as a guiding ideal for millions of people has lost its capacity to inspire. And that's because it failed everywhere it was tried. Why did it fail? Can it be that all those old fogies who said, well, human nature was not socialistic, it was more oriented toward free enterprise, can those old fogies have been right? It seems hard to believe. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Now we're going to talk about power. What is power, and specifically, what is political power? Well, we need a definition of power. So I'm going to say, when we're talking about power, we're talking about a capacity or an ability or a disposition And the word power means the same when we talk about the power of an engine as it does when we talk about the power of a human being. And that means that the power is a matter of capacity, and you may have the power even though it is not exercised. So there are all kinds of powers that my engine has that have never been exercised. I've never driven it at full capacity. And there are all sorts of powers of the presidency that the President of the United States would never exercise. Now, there's a horrendous mistake in the book that I asked you to buy, and I have to correct it in the next printing. I say that the American president has the power to, as commander-in-chief, to command American armies in the field. But I say no American president has ever done that while president. Usually you do it, and then you get to be president on the base of that, like Washington or Grant or Eisenhower. They all commanded American armies as generals, and then they got the job of the president as a reward for their success. But it was pointed out to me by a famous constitutional lawyer that I say no American president has ever commanded the armies of the United States in the field while president. Well, Washington did at the time of the Whiskey Rebellion. How could I have forgotten the Whiskey Rebellion? God. I mean, we ought to all be thinking about the Whiskey Rebellion, and here I had forgotten about the Whiskey Rebellion. It's an odd fact, incidentally, about the United States that whiskey plays such a crucial role in our history. Why? Well, Americans found ways to grow wheat better than anybody, but what do you do with all this damn wheat before there are any railroads? There's no way to take this wheat to the market. Well, there's something you can do to it very cheaply. Convert it into whiskey. And so you have all kinds of whiskey made with different kinds of grain, rye whiskey and bourbon and all these other things made with wheat. So whiskey is a big thing in American history, hence Prohibition had a kind of plausibility here, because you could get drunk for a nickel in the early days of our glorious country. All right, anyway, I'm now going to talk about power. I'm going to talk about power and what it means for someone to have power over somebody else. I saw some other hands up. No, okay, here we go. The definition of power. You have to say who has power over whom with respect to what exactly. You can't just say that A has power over B, but you say that A has power over B with respect to Act A. What does it mean to say that somebody has power over somebody else with respect to a certain type of action, with respect to an action type? And I think the answer is that to say that A has power over B with respect to the action type is to say that A can get B to do what he wants him to do, regardless of whether or not B wants to do it. Yes?
You're describing a specific type of power right now, right?
I'm going to get to political power, yeah.
But having power over another agent.
I'm just talking about power in general. The power that I'm defining now is the power that parents have over their children, for example.
One kind of power. Because there's also power to, like somebody having power to inspire with a beautiful music.
No, I am going to describe a distinction between power and influence. Power is as I'm discussing it here, is the ability to have power over people, is to have the ability to make them do what you want, even in cases where they don't want to do it. Yeah, no, there is a perfectly general definition of power that applies to people and engines, and it is a capacity. Power is a type of capacity or ability and may exist even when it's not exercised. What is interesting about the power of human beings over other human beings is that it is the ability, it has to do with a type of intentionality. It's the ability to intentionally make other people do something whether or not they want to do it. Now that's crucial, is that if they want to do it anyway, then you may have the power, but their doing it will not be an exercise of your power. So the exercise of power is the case where you make people do something whether they want to or not, but if it's the case that they already were going to do it, then it's not an exercise of power. So if the university has a rule that professors have to lecture only with shirts on, well, that would not be an exercise of their power, because I like lecturing with shirts on anyway. It's not, the strip to the waist lecture is not one I want to give. It distracts too many people. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay, but now there's several features of this definition. It's not as innocent as it looks. First of all, the exercise of power must be intentional. So, for example, I picked this rather lame example. I'm not sure we ought to be able to get a better one. But suppose that I smell so bad that whenever I come into a room, everybody else gets up and leaves. That's not an exercise of power. It's just an unfortunate effect that my presence has. On the other hand, if I discover this and I decide I want to clear out rooms by going in and stinking up the place so that everybody leaves, then it becomes an exercise of power. So the exercise of power requires intentionality. It requires that it's done intentionally. But now, there are special cases, though, where, I remember my definition was, it's the ability to make someone do something whether or not that person wants to do it. There will be special cases. One is where you get them to want something that they would not otherwise want. And that is the case where this is sometimes called the power of persuasion, where you can, advertising is capable of exerting a kind of power by getting people to want things that they would not otherwise have wanted. And that has to be distinguished, though, from the unintentional effects of certain activities. So, for example, if I say, look, it is an effect of football on television on Sunday afternoons that it produces lots more consumption of beer and potato chips because people sit around watching football games and drinking a lot of beer and eating potato chips, that's not an exercise of power unless you're selling beer and potato chips. But just for the people putting on the football games, they're just trying to get bigger audiences so they can sell more advertising time. So it is not an effect of power because it's not intentionally exercised. Power, the exercise of power must be intentional, but one species of that is intentionally getting people to want something they would not otherwise have wanted. Now there's again another special case of the exercise of power, and that is where you prevent people from seeing available options which they might have found attractive if they had seen the available options. I'm not saying that this was done cynically, but at the time of the instigation of the Iraq War, the government presented us, essentially, they presented the citizenry with the option, look, either you get rid of Saddam Hussein or you risk nuclear destruction because he has these weapons of mass destruction. So there were the available options that we were presented with were skewed. They were less than was in fact available. So another type of exercise of power is getting people to perceive certain options as available rather than other options as available. Okay, now having said that, I want to distinguish a certain other thing. I'll take questions in a minute. I just want to get this out. I have defined power and in terms of the exercise of power, and power is the ability to exercise power, but in its exercise it must be done intentionally with respect to certain actions. And there are two special cases where you get people to want something they would not otherwise have wanted, and cases where you get them only to perceive a limited range of actions available. Now I need to distinguish power, leadership, and influence. Power has to be distinguished from influence because in my case, the unintentional exercise of power is distinctly odd. It's mostly the cases you can give of that will be cases where you exercised power intentionally, but you had effects that you did not intend. But influence need not be exercised intentionally. There are all kinds of influences on you that are not cases of the intentional exercise of power. And the example I give in the reading that I've assigned you is John Dewey had a great deal of influence on American education, but he exercised very little power. The actual power was exercised by legislatures and school boards who followed his influence. So the influence, as distinct from power, need not be done intentionally. The unintentional exercise of power is typically an unintended consequence of the exercise of power, but unintentional influence is very common. Any professor, anybody who lectures, as I do, has all kinds of unintended effects on the students. Some people find his style of lecturing offensive, others find it attractive, but these are influences that he has without any intentionality. It's just an unintended effect. Now, power versus leadership is another distinction, and to over-idealize it slightly, the mark of the leader, as opposed to just power, is that the effective leader can get people to want things that they would not otherwise have wanted. See, power is the ability to get people to do things, whether they want to or not. But one type of that is leadership, where the leader can get people to want things that they would not otherwise have wanted. And effective political leaders are good at articulating the mood of the public in such a way as to formulate precise desires which are then shared by large numbers of people. The classic case is Churchill. You see, in history, we always make it look as if, well, somehow it was inevitable that Britain would continue to resist Hitler. Not true. Most of the members of the ruling part of the Conservative Party, Lord Halifax prominently among them, wanted to make a deal. They thought it's ridiculous to keep fighting the Nazis. Everybody who's fought the Nazis has lost spectacularly. And so why should we continue to do that? Let's make an agreement so that we can end this war. Churchill, on the other hand, insisted on fighting on, and he made very effective speeches which exhibited a quality of leadership. The mark of leadership is that, in the political case, is you continue to be powerful even when you are, as they say, out of power. So there are lots of people who continue to exercise power even when they're out of power, even when they're no longer in office, and lots of people in office who are ineffective as leaders. Carter is the classic case. You see, if you're president of the United States, the first thing you have to do is to set a certain type of tone to the government so that ordinary bureaucrats will know what they're supposed to do. Most of the day-to-day decisions of a government are made by GS-13s. GS-13 means Government Service 13. It's a rank in the civil service, and it's roughly equivalent, I don't know, to a major or lieutenant colonel in the Army. So who gets a passport? Who gets admitted to the country on a visa? Those decisions are not made by the Secretary of State. They're made by the GS-13. Now, the GS-13 has to know what the policy of the government is. And in the case of Carter, nobody knew. They didn't know what the policy of the government was. Reagan, on the other hand, everybody knew what the policy of the government was. They might not have liked it, but they knew precisely what it was because Reagan was an effective political leader in a way that Carter was not. Watch the reaction of the military because the military lives on leadership. They hated Carter. They liked Roosevelt because he was an effective leader. They liked Reagan because he was an effective leader. So the mark of leadership is not the same as official power because the effective leader continues to remain powerful even when he's out of power. And Churchill and de Gaulle are classic cases of people who remained powerful even when they were out of power. My son, who's now a lieutenant colonel in the Green Berets, once pointed out to me, he said, at the Searle dining room table, you can live for years and never hear a discussion of leadership. It's not something we talk about at the dinner table. I mean, indirect speech acts, yes, or favorite authors or movies, fine. But leadership? Who the hell cares about leadership? Well, anyway, leadership is a big deal where the military is concerned, basically, because you got to get people to go risk their lives just because you told them to do it, and that means you have to have, in addition to official power, you have to have a capacity for leadership. And one of the marks of a successful president is that the president has both constitutional power and effective leadership. Carter was the most ineffective leader within recent memory. Yeah, much worse than Clinton. No, Clinton was pretty bad too. Okay, now having made these distinctions between power, leadership, and influence, I now want to go to discuss political power. Now, there are two constraints on our discussion of power that we have already identified, and I want to make them explicit. There's the intentional constraint, or the intentionality constraint, that says the exercise of power has to be something that's done intentionally. And then there is what you might call the exactness constraint, because whenever A exercises power over B, it must always be with respect to some specific form of action or activity. So you have an intentionality constraint and an exactness constraint. Now, before we go to politics, I want to digress a bit to discuss Foucault's notion of biopower. This has been very influential. And the idea that Foucault has is that our lives are infused with invisible power networks. There are these invisible structures of power, and we're locked into them. They are inevitable. The structure of complex societies like our own enforces a kind of power on us that he calls biopower, and it's exercised by, for example, educators, teachers, healthcare professionals, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists. They're always exercising a normalizing influence on us. They're always forcing us into a kind of normalized mode of existence, and any departure from this normalized mode is corrected. And furthermore, this is one of the things that makes Foucault uncomfortable. Many of the things that we think are precisely liberating are just power by another means. So, for example, many people thought that the social changes of the 60s and 70s brought about a form of sexual liberation. There were sexual liberation movements. But, says Foucault, what appears to be sexual liberation is in fact another form of the exercise of biopower. In the old days, you were expected to be repressed and constrained, but given sexual liberation, you're supposed to be attractive, sexually active, energetic. So we have replaced repression. We have replaced repression by oppression, where you're oppressed with regard to your sexual behavior. We have replaced that with oppression by stimulation. So what you think of as sexually liberating is in fact simply a new form of oppression. So Foucault does not offer you a cheerful conception. And I always thought it was a lot of hot air, Foucault, and I couldn't make much sense out of it, and it's not very clear, but I want to show you there's a version of it that we can make sense of in light of the material that we've been talking about in this course. And that is, the question we're forced to here is, can we make his conception of biopower consistent with the intentionality constraint? It has to be exercised intentionally. Whose intentions are these biopower intentions? And there has to be some precise statement of who is exercising power over us with exactly to what actions. And I'm not now going to talk about Foucault because I don't know how to interpret him, and he admits it wasn't written very clearly, and He wasn't a theory, and it was just a lot of ideas he had, and there's lots of discussion. I'm now not going to talk about Foucault, but what I find useful in this idea that there are forms of power structures in a society that don't meet the official conception of what constitutes a power, such as having the legal authority to impose taxes or the legal authority to give you a ticket on the freeway. And I'm going to call these background power. There's a form of background, or to be more precise, we might call it background network power, where there's a background and a network that constrains you in various ways, and I think can be described in such a way that it meets these two constraints. We can tell you exactly what power is being exercised over you and exactly who is doing the exercise. It's a bit surprising when you spell it out. Yes?
Why do you need the exactness constraint?
Yeah.
Let's say that I'm going to be Stalin, and I just want power over everything.
Yeah, but suppose, for example, you don't care about what color socks people wear. I mean, there will be aspects, or whether or not they look up at the sky or don't look up at the sky. There'll be, I mean, in fact, people like Stalin, though they did have totalitarian power, wanted power over what, for example, what people could read, what they could think, what sort of organizations they could belong to, what kind of education. But what kind of flowers they planted in their garden, Stalin didn't care. Or if he cared about that, there were other things he didn't care about, like whether or not they put on their right shoe first or their left shoe first. So totalitarian states are famous for their interference in all kinds of private aspects of life. But even there are things where the totalitarian's indifferent. Yes, you, and then you. Yeah.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean, but I agree that there seems like there's a concept of background power.
Yeah.
But how does that, I mean, you said that you can describe it so that it fits those two requirements of having, so that you can say who's exercising the power, and I don't understand how you.
I'm sorry?
How can you talk about someone exercising
Yeah.
background power?
Yeah. I'm getting to that. I mean, I haven't answered that question. I want to get to that. Well, how much time we got? I probably don't have an awful lot of time. Oh, I got a couple minutes. Okay. There is a set of background presuppositions on which we all behave. And background power is exercised when you violate that. And people will impose on you certain types of constraints. They will attempt to, there will be certain sorts of sanctions. I live in Berkeley, so I know this. It's a very conformist society, Berkeley. If you hold opinions that are regarded as impermissible in Berkeley, people will impose various sanctions on you. If you walk down Telegraph Avenue with a racist sign, for example, people will not, they won't tolerate it. They don't believe in free speech. So there are all kinds of ways in which you will be constrained. Now, what is the content of the background power? It's always the same. The content is conform. And different communities have different things they want you to conform to, but the content is always conform. And who exercises this power? Anybody who wants to impose conformity on anybody else can exercise background power. So if you observe somebody in Berkeley endorsing or carrying a sign that that is regarded as politically totally unacceptable, it supports Nazism or racism or whatever, what you will find, I'm predicting, is that people don't believe in free speech. They will impose sanctions against you. They might just shout obscenities at you or various sorts of things, but they will attempt to impose sanctions. So the content constraint, the exactness constraint, is always the same for background power. It is conform to the background. And the intentionality constraint, somebody has to be doing this, is anybody can exercise background power over anybody. And the means is, ask yourself, what are the means for imposing conformity? The kid who came to class naked, I never saw this kid, but there was a kid who did this in Berkeley, and it created, even in Berkeley, it created, how shall I say, bizarreness reactions. people thought that we can't put up with this. They can't tolerate this. Now, I don't know that there's a law against this. If there isn't, I'm sure they'll find one. Is there a law that says you can't go to class with no clothes on? I doubt it. But in any case, there is a law? Okay. All right. But in any case, even if there wasn't a law, I mean, if I showed up in a mini skirt and high heels and really sexy lipstick, I think there would be various forms of constraint imposed on me, and that's a case of background power. So in any society, there are limits as to what is permissible behavior, and they may or may not be marked by the law. I gather from the restlessness of the troops that we have reached the end of the hour. We'll go on with this on Tuesday.